Hi, and welcome to Artalaap, South Asia's first independent visual culture podcast, with me, Kamayani. I am delighted to invite you to this special episode of Artalaap titled Vestibular Criticism. This episode follows a residency that I was grateful to have been awarded as part of the Art Writers Award 2024. It's an award that is given annually by Helvetia, which is the Swiss Arts Council, and Take On Art magazine, to an art writer. So, just to give you all a bit of context, this summer I spent 2 months based in a lovely city near Zürich called Winterthur. I summered in Winterthur, and while enjoying the classic Bollywood fantasy in Switzerland's Haseen Wadiyan, I met some phenomenal artists, critics, curators, scholars, podcasters, and cultural practitioners who were incredibly generous with their time and knowledge. And one of these generous interlocutors is my guest on today's podcast. Let me introduce you to her. Geraldine Tedder is a curator and writer based in Zurich. She is currently the director of Kunsthalle Winterthur. She has worked with numerous artists on exhibitions and publications, and she regularly contributes to various art journals. In today's episode, we'll talk about our writing and curating practices through the metaphor of the vestibular system. And I know that sounds like an earful, quite literally. That's because it is. The vestibular system is located in our inner ear and is responsible for balancing and for spatial orientation. But vestibular has another meaning, which is, and I'm quoting directly from the dictionary, relating to empty spaces in the body that are entrances to passages or other spaces. So, taking off from that meaning, in this episode, Geraldine and I speak about how criticism and curating can help us stabilize and situate ourselves in the contemporary, and about the many forms that the relationships between writing, speaking, and listening can take. Through all of this, we'll reflect together on how repairing, caring, and loving can be modes of creating knowledge. Hi, Geraldine. How are you?
Hi, Kamayani. I'm good, thank you. And you?
All good. Thank you so much for joining me on this special episode titled Vestibular Criticism.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me. It's really great that we can do this.
Yeah. And I want to start by very briefly, quickly unpacking the title of the episode, Vestibular Criticism, and setting it up a little bit for the audience. So, the vestibular system, which we can go into a bit later, is linked to the ear, to the physiology of listening and the condition of orality. And in this episode, Geraldine and I are looking to explore the relationship between listening and writing, between the oral and the textual and the curatorial. And both of us will speak a little bit about our own works and our own projects and practices as we navigate through these interrelationships. So, Geraldine, as I mentioned in my introduction, you contribute critical writing to a number of art publications. And I want to start by bringing up your essay for the Zurich based magazine Brand New Life. The title of your essay is You Are Probably Completely Oblivious That This Text Actually Is About You, which is a riff on the title of a very famous essay from the 90s by the feminist scholar Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick. Do you want to take us through this piece and, talk a little bit about how you think that the kinds of ideas that you're discussing in the piece maybe speak to this relationship between the oral and the critical and the conversational, perhaps?
Yeah, so this article, it's the text it was based on by Sedgwick, was called You're So Paranoid, You Probably Think This Text Is About You. And then I wrote a text about this text, turning around from being completely paranoid that the text actually is about oneself to being completely oblivious that it actually could be about you and there should be some more self-criticality going about. And basically Sedgwick talks about these two positions. One of them is the reparative position and the other is the paranoid position. And she says that in Western critique especially, that the paranoid position is the dominant position, which is one of kind of maintaining objective distance, of rehashing theories that are already canonical, also somehow to credit your own critique as well with these theories, kind of hiding behind them perhaps, rather than making yourself vulnerable with more open or not so distinguished positions in theory and critique. So one could maybe sum up, it's also about taking on a certain authority or implementing a certain structure in critique. And this essay was very much about trying to break with that authority. So having a certain self-criticality in where you're coming from when you're writing or making critique, and declaring that position. So somehow making it clear, okay, this is my little space of knowledge that I'm coming from, and I have absolutely no right or competence to be able to, say that this is truth. Anyway, I think in general, I'm really interested in these types of positions that try to break up authoritative structures and making things somehow more fluid, perhaps also more complex. How language, of course, in general has this authority that comes with it. And I think maybe here is also the transition to when we're thinking about writing and orality and how these two work with language. Of course, it has something very fixed and in this sense can also very quickly become essentialistic or categorized when writing, whereas orality has this much more kind of dynamic practice of language around it. I mean, also much more fleeting, that can allow for really more snags, I would say. Maybe snag is a good word as well to go into it. So this was kind of what I was getting at in the text, also because it was a time that I was really thinking about my own position as a writer, but also as a curator. And maybe this also kind of segues a little bit to how I also see my curatorial practice. Often you have this idea of a curator also coming from a certain authority in what positions you're choosing, in how you can judge content or pick positions, or somehow having very much an expertise. And I think that this is just, maybe true to a certain point, or completely untrue to the point of how we perceive curators often still today. And that it's really much more about collaboration with the artists and going with them and not somehow ahead of them. And I think this is something that you're also really interested in, these more fleeting poetic moments maybe as well. Especially also in today's context, we could maybe talk a little bit about that. I think that would be really interesting too.
Yeah, for sure. And thanks for sharing your thoughts on how we might think about orality as a challenge to the fixity of print and text. It's a kind of reversal of the classic Walter Org position, right? Where the written is privileged and becomes an index of civilization and knowledge in this very colonial way as well. Because print culture often was a form of imperialization, colonization, and imposition of knowledge structures as well. And I'm also quite interested in what you said about the fleeting, the transience is really productive, I think, to also think through this horizontality of the dialogue or the polylogue or the conversation, in that there are sort of multiple interlocutors or a certain kind of egalitarianism to the plane at which people speak to each other in a conversation and are able to push back maybe in real time or challenge each other in real time. Though, of course, this is not to downplay the pre-existing structural power differential that can often exist between speakers, even in a conversation, of course, but only to think of it, the conversation, as a potentially more leveling form than others, since it involves direct, immediate speech. Even just the temporal structure of a conversation versus, written material, I think, can be useful to think through when engaging in shared or collaborative critical commentary. And also, I quite like what you said about the snag, because when we think of a snag, we think of something accidentally being caught on, on a protuberance or something that you weren't expecting it to be caught by. So I think that's quite nice as well, that there is a kind of unexpectedness that is built into these kinds of formats of orality that we can think about when we discuss reparative reading, but also reparative writing. And I think actually that's something I wanted to maybe go into with you a little bit. There's a line in your essay where you talk about the affective nature of what is being said. And this affective quality, I think, almost in opposition to the cognitive, might be something to explore together, not necessarily in antagonism with each other, but just the fictions can be quite useful as well, maybe, to think through. So just wanted you to weigh in on that.
Yeah, I mean, that's something whilst you were talking, I was thinking about as well somehow. And I guess it goes in the same direction. I was thinking about a performativity also that comes with certain types of writing, but also types of oral critiques like we're doing now, which is, of course, very much in orality also about rhetorics, but in written critique, perhaps also really about how we're shaping language in a way that keeps it more open. Yeah, maybe also going more into something that Cedric also gets into is not only what is being written, but also why it's being written and how. So what kind of effect does it also have, and how is it producing knowledge in the end? And I think it's important here to distinguish between practices. I mean, if we can talk about fiction as well, I think that's also a really interesting tool, for speculation. But I am very much interested also in practices that stay in grounded reality or is somehow looking at social, political issues of today, but how they're dealing with it is really trying to seek out the complexity in those situations rather than just trying to figure it out, what something could be. And in this sense, also kind of categorizing it and reproducing a certain type of critique that can often be problematic. And I think what we could also talk about a little bit, because when preparing for this talk, I was thinking about this interest very much that we share in these types of formats and methods, but also how perhaps right now we should also talk about the pitfalls of that, like perhaps more informal ways of knowledge production can perhaps also be instrumentalized much more quickly. How, there's this very kind of hop, skip, and a step to things like misinformation. And yeah, I was wondering also what you think about that, because it's something that is on my mind as well, like how much do we need to go back to really being able to say this is fact, this is speculation, this is conspiracy.
Yeah, the return of the paranoid.
Yeah,
But it's with reason.
Yeah.
It's like a founded paranoia in our current climate. And these are also really questions of media infrastructures as well. I mean, right from cuneiform tablets to the internet, it's all been a process of revisiting the politics of the media infrastructure and what it enables or doesn't enable. And this is where, again, to come back to the idea of fixity and print, that becomes once again something to think about. You find increasingly that the media forms that historically were considered most trustworthy, print, for instance, no longer meet that standard. And also subaltern forms of communication, which have historically been outside of print, they are now circulating in ways that also cannot be said to be fully reliable, right? So I think what you bring up is actually really important. And obviously we are maybe more invested in thinking about critical writing and curatorial writing, but as we know, these are just asymptotes, right, of political and social communication that isn't just about art. So yeah, I think it's very important to actually think through what all of this means and what orality means in the present moment. And to not also sort of blindly valorize it. I mean, to be circumspect about how we think about it. And I think some of it is a question of form, really. It's a question of formal structures that we have to think closely and deeply about.
So with formal structures, you really mean kind of how we're now, like we're talking together on this podcast. You mean kind of these, like what formats it takes on?
Yeah, like the podcast is a form, right? And the dialogue is a form, conversation is a form. It doesn't always have to be necessarily a liberatory form. It can be used, misused, abused. Any form can. We have to be more alert and invested in making sure that the forms we adopt outside of these hegemonies that have historically inframed us, they live up to those promises of a certain kind of horizontality or egalitarianism or integrity, the integrity of the messages that we want to exchange.
Yeah, that's a good word. That's true. Yeah. And also because some of the words are so overused. I mean, again, a problem that we face, but yeah. I mean, I was wondering really also how to hear from you really how that, how you see now having done this podcast for a while now, really the value in these exchanges via podcast, I would be really interested to hear that.
It's really interesting because I also come from a pretty traditional classical training as a art historian or film historian. I mean, somebody who's very embedded in traditional modalities of generating commentary about art, whether it's art history or art criticism. So moving towards this format, there was a steep learning curve involved for me as well. And I mean, I'd like to actually anchor it in just very basic facts about the process of shifting, say, from writing texts that are meant to be read versus scripts that are meant to be listened to. Just that difference, I think, and that's the really basic difference. But when I started out, I found myself writing how I would write for, say, a publication, an art publication, and trying to vocalize that in my podcast. And I found very quickly that that's not a particularly a fair way to treat language that is meant to behave differently.
Yeah.
It's like being the parent of two kids with very different temperaments, like you can't expect a language that is orientated to orality to behave the same as language that is orientated towards textuality. So I think that was a big difference that I noticed, even just at a very basic level, as I started scripting. And I think the description of the artwork, which is, I think, a fundamental unit, right, of critical writing or serious art historical writing. And I think a lot of times, in the more recent era, I find that people move away from it to the detriment of criticism. The description of the artwork, it has to anchor your commentary about the work or about other things that have nothing to do with art. That's fair enough. But I think if you position yourself as an art writer, then the artwork has to be at the heart of whatever you write. So the description of the artwork itself, I think, became a site for me to work out this friction between the textual and the oral. Like, what is ekphrasis, right? It's basically the verbal description of something visual. And you find that the strategies you use to contend with that in writing for readership is really different from what you would adopt for a listenership. And I found that that was really something that helped me frame that journey. Like, what is it that I'm doing differently as a writer? And I actually went back to W.J.T. Mitchell. He's written a lot about ekphrasis and ekphrastic hope, as you know. And he had an interview in which he said he imagined writing his book, Iconology, as a book about pictures for the blind, a book of rumors about pictures and how people talk about them behind their backs, as it were. So what would you imagine pictures were if you couldn't see them, but could just hear what people said about them? So that for me captured the essence of being able to gossip about artworks. And these are also unseen artworks. I mean, even though I have an image guide, but essentially you hear us talk about the works in their absence. So that adds to the feeling of being part of gossip. And that's the intimacy of the podcast format, I think. It allows for you to frame it that way or think about it that way for yourself.
Yeah. I want to say two things in response to that. The first one is I also noticed how intertwined those two practices are. Being a curator, really so much happening in conversation with the artists and how we're talking about the work in the time it's being made, when perhaps me and also the artists are both kind of really finding out in the middle of this process of finding out, okay, what are we actually talking about? How is this being expressed in the artwork, and how are we going to talk about this expression of the artwork? Like all those somehow levels actually happening at the same time, which I think is something important to say. Like, of course, then something else happens when I write the exhibition text, and then somehow still trying to get even closer to the core of this artwork. And I really try and stay quite close like you say, somehow in these descriptions of the artwork, it may not be actually direct descriptions, but somehow stay close to these descriptions. And then the other thing I wanted to just quickly say, because you mentioned this word gossip, which I think is also like a really fruitful kind of thing to talk about, because we also did a year ago or 2 years ago, maybe even now, we invited Silvia Federici, who wrote this book about gossip, where again, we really see how this informal structure was obviously incredibly subversive. Gossip originally meant actually a gathering of women exchanging knowledge, because it was the way that they could exchange knowledge and also establish a certain network that could be supportive of each other.
Yeah.
And just, kind of looping back to what we were talking about before, how all these forms can also be, of course, misused, but some of the strategic positions also in all of these forms are really important, which it's something I think about a lot, like which forms am I taking on now when I'm speaking from a more subversive position, which forms am I, taking on speaking as the institution. It's something that kind of, in my position, also a little bit goes hand in hand often, but somehow navigating through these different formats,
Yeah, that's actually super interesting that you brought up Federici's work as well. And I think this idea, of gossip also being a particular kind of response, again, to dominant cultures of information exchange and orality, right?
Yeah.
There's a whole feminist theorization of gossip as being protective for marginalized communities. And in fact, oral history as a format, and I say oral history, but it's also oral history, because as one is speaking, there is the interlocutor listening as well, right? And I feel like oral history has traditionally, as you know, not been given the place that it perhaps ought to have been given in art historiography and art critical practices. And there are actually not many robust examples of serious oral history methodology being used to generate or produce knowledge about or reflections on art historical material. So I think that's also kind of interesting what you brought up from a curator's perspective.
Are there any, actually, I would be curious, that about that are really like a good example?
I mean, in Switzerland, I managed to speak to a few people. Dora Imhoff from the Oral History Archive at ETH Zurich. And then there's Federica Martini and Julie Enkel at HEAD in Geneva, who've done similar work. And they've used oral history to mine the emergence of particular art scenes at a particular moment in history. Dora is focused on the German-speaking Basel, Zurich area. And then Federica and Julie have focused on the Francophone Swiss art scene.
And what formats do they interview especially?
Yeah, so a lot of thick interviews with practitioners who've been kind of left out of the classical textual archive as well. Because historically, as we know, certain kinds of people were left out of the canon for reasons that didn't really have anything to do with the quality of their work, but also a lot to do with who they were and their identities. So oral history is also a way of rehabilitating and restoring lost voices. Women, queer artists, non-white artists and cultural practitioners. And in the case of India, Dalit and Adivasi artists who are oppressed by the caste system. So I think all of those things are also a reason to keep exploring this as a possible mode. And actually, I want to hear from you, again, as a curator, how you think of orality, listening as a kind of act of care. Because curation, as we know etymologically, is linked to caregiving, and the ecclesiastical practices of listening within the church. Confession, for instance, they kind of can constitute some kind of a picture to think about orality in a curatorial context. But would love to hear from you what you think.
Yeah, I guess it goes into a little bit what I said towards the beginning of the recording, which is really how I understand this role as a curator. For a very long time, I found it really strange to call myself curator, because I always found it a little bit has this kind of cringe between a discrepancy of how this profession is understood and somehow the tradition of this profession, and then how the reality actually is. And I mean, of course, there are those curators who are really only working in content, who clearly have an authority over content and how they're working with artists. Maybe if you're working in a big, large museum and so on, you're working on retrospective mainly, you have a completely different position. But me working at Kunsthalle, a small contemporary art institution, really working very closely with artists, it always felt quite strange to somehow summon this authority in a sense when you're saying that you're a curator. And because I really feel like I am learning, I guess my approach is quite intuitive as well. I mean, of course, it's based also on experience and so on, and also on knowledge. But when I invite an artist to make an exhibition here at Kunsthalle, I very often know that I am completely fascinated by what they're doing, but I'm not quite sure why yet. And actually the process of being in exchange with them, and of course this is mainly in conversations that we have, I like to work really for a long time. So like a year and a half before I'll invite an artist, and then we'll really start the process of talking and meeting, and until then the exhibition actually happens. And in this, I am also learning about, this artistic position and why I find it so relevant now. And usually then at some point it gets to the point like, now we've worked through this together. But really, more this understanding of going, learning together, also really in these oral practices that are, of course, often not very visible in the end because everything happens behind closed doors. This is something I've also kind of thought about, if there are ways to make it more visible, which would be interesting, because I feel like it is happening in other domains, like in criticism, like you doing these podcasts and being like, okay, I'm going to try and practice criticism differently. And it's not happening so much yet in curation, or it's not so visible maybe yet. I feel like it's actually happening because people who are kind of heading institutions now also have other, I feel, more realistic ideas of what this actually means. But to make it visible, I also thought about, could there be formats, where, for instance, if you're doing a group show, the kind of standard thing to do would be to write to all the artists and you have separate conversations going on. And if there's a way, that you can just really work on it together, you have several workshops and then you're talking about the exhibition and you're really forming it together rather than this curator holding all the different communication, lines in one hand. So that's kind of things that I'm thinking about.
That's really interesting. It reminds me a little bit of how in theater, the rehearsal is a space for people to co-develop a text, even if the text pre-exists.
Yeah.
The interpretations of the text by actors, by directors, that can completely change. Or, a concert, like a conductor is a director, but actually each performance or each recital of the musical opus or the piece is different.
Yeah.
And there are rehearsals that lead up to it. And maybe you're right, like this is a fantastic way to think about divesting the curatorial paradigm of that autocratic or authoritarian orientation.
Yeah, totally. I think that's really, that's a good and kind of really interesting word, the rehearsal. Something I've written down on my page in big letters. Maybe it's like something I can use in the future. But it's also, I think, I'm realizing now also as we speak, actually, that it's really something that keeps popping up, this idea of really also trying to break down this working alone behind closed doors, and how do we open those things up. And actually the very first exhibition that I curated here at Kunsthalle was called Script Memory, which of course is also fitting to this idea of the rehearsal and the script and the oral. And it was about artists who are actually interested in really including others in the process of making work. So often it was also people they were closely involved with, and this also had the reason that they were kind of questioning their own role as well as artists, and also again the authority that comes with making works about your and others' lives in the end. How could you break up these and make it kind of polyphonic, what we're seeing, what we're hearing?
That's such a great word, polyphonic. And I feel like the people that I've spoken to who are working in the critical realm on these ideas. They all use it, and it's such a rich word and really taps into that sense of a communitarian co-production.
Yeah.
And I think actually just to kind of go back to the Vestibular, which is what the title of our episode is as well. And I want to ask about your audiobook as well on that note. So the reason I really gravitated towards the word vestibular is because I realized as I, worked through this conceptually that the ear is not just responsible for audition, but also for orientation, for balance, for motion. And as I mentioned in the intro to this episode, one dictionary definition of vestibular, which really resonated with me, was, and I'm quoting, relating to empty spaces in the body that are entrances to passages or other spaces. And that really kind of brought together the interconnection between listening and imagination and liberation. So I also wanted to talk to you about that by segueing to the audiobook that you produced with the artist Chantal Kaufman, titled Notes on Furniture. And maybe you can talk about that as we segue from the idea of the vestibular to the spatial. Because in your essay, you sort of invoke orientation, containment, transcendence, all of these very spatial categories.
Yeah.
And maybe you can even read something from the essay to give our listeners a sense.
Yeah, sure. I would love to do that. I mean, I was also actually thinking, I'm glad that you segued to it, because I was thinking about that when you were speaking about the vestibular also as something very bodily, and how you're putting focus on that rather than maybe also really in the titling of the podcast, and in this sense also on more of a physical space and how we encounter each other in the physical space. And I mean, the essay was actually a presentation, like a reading or a lecture reading, I guess something in between, that I wrote this text for a place called Fria, which is a contemporary art institution here in Freiburg in Switzerland. And I read this text, which was connected to an exhibition that was going on there, which was called A Home is Not a House is Not a Home. So also very much kind of questions of belonging and notions of space, which is why I then kind of got onto this idea of furniture. And I look at 3 texts. One of them is, again, a text by Cedric, because I was kind of reading a super fan, all of her works at a certain point, which is called Epistemology of the Closet. And another text was text by Sarah Ahmed, Queer Phenomenology. And then the third text is The Undercommons by Fred Moten and Stefano Harni. So also texts that were really being read very broadly, at least in an art context in this time. And it kind of takes different types of furniture as chapters. So I look at the desk for writing in connection to Sarah Ahmed's text, and how these objects can really tell us also a lot about the way we have been orientated towards certain types of, again, knowledge production or study, depending on where we're coming from. And then the second is the closet, where Cedric really takes the closet as an image for which knowledge can be disclosed and which not. So she's specifically talking about homophobia and also being able to say or not you're homosexual, especially during the AIDS crisis. And then the third chapter is looking at the university chair, which is kind of a little bit going away from a concrete object, but it goes into notions of study that Fred Moten and Stefano Harni are looking at. And I wanted to read actually a little passage from this, because I feel like it is what connects the most to also what we're talking about in terms of thinking differently about study that takes place in different places and in different formats. So, study, as the university intends it, is connected to student loans and credit to be gained, to accreditation, to getting a degree, going out and giving back what you owe. It is connected to a process of professionalization, to becoming a critic, asking the right questions, finding solutions, optimizing. Back to the straight line, which brings with it pressures of giving back to those who have invested in you, invested in a promise of return. Moten and Harni think about study that deviates, that happens on a different register than capitalism, a space where you can de-link credit and debt. In the undercommons, the expectation of repayment has no place, only bad debt is to be found here, debt that enters credit into crisis, debt that needs no return. And now I'm quoting Fred Moten. We saw it in a step yesterday, some hips, a smile, the way a hand moved. We heard it in a break, a cut, a lilt, the way the words leapt. We felt it in the way someone saves the best stuff just to give it to you, and then it's gone, given a debt. They don't want nothing. You have got to accept it. You have got to accept that. Quotes ended, finished. It's, would you like a ride, some money for the locker? Would your friend's friend like to stay over? Would you like part of my cheese sandwich? Would you like my opinion, my seat, a cigarette? They would say, so Moten and Hani would say, thank goodness joy doesn't count for enough, cannot be counted well enough. Moten and Hani's study is beyond the university chair because it is as the chair that it becomes limited and limiting. Yet it can take place within the university. It is, however, in some other relation to it. Structures such as the chair not only represents, but because to be critical of the university would mean being the professional par excellence. Being neither for nor against the university, Moten and Hani also acknowledge that dropping out isn't going to pay the bills. How their idea of study could take place is far more subtle. They give the example of calling a class to order, a custom understanding by which when class begins, study begins. But what if this order never came? The students are bustling about, perhaps talking to one another, exchanging. Study is already happening. There is no need for this call, for this order. The undercommons is everywhere as well as in specific places. It can take place at any moment and at all time. It spreads, is constantly in motion. You might start seeing it all over. I did. It's in between, often gone before you know it, ordinary, everyday, in every relationship to things that are not necessarily understood to be political. It happens among strangers, there all the time, all along. The undercommons cannot be seized. It is hidden, so slippery it escapes the long arm of the law of policies of capital. It is the failure of coordinated processes, a point of negation in favor of the mere passing of time. I'll finish there. Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing that extract with us. I think it's really powerful and ties lots of things that we've been discussing. Also thinking about sort of spatial metaphors that you used in this essay. There's something about existing on a coordinate that is very bracing, I think, even as a reader. Of course, also as a person in the world. It also felt a bit like, in a nice way, like a guided tool through a curation, because all of the texts that you've assembled, they kind of illuminate something that we need you to illuminate for us. So I thought that was really meaningful as well, to think about just stabilizing oneself within a text.
Yeah, thanks. And I didn't think about that actually, how that it was so connected to curation. I haven't somehow thought about it that way, but of course, yeah, it's true.
I mean, we're too close to our own words, right? Like you always need a listener or a reader to tell you what the effects are.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I wanted to kind of maybe play the ball back to you. There was one quote that I kind of picked out of yours, which is when you write about Sontag's plea for erotics.
Do you mean me referencing Susan Sontag's idea of erotics in my essay? My essay was called Loving with Language. Yeah, I wrote that for the Projects Processes series of Serendipity Arts Foundation.
Yeah. So you write, the meanings are not hidden underneath a layer but darkened by shadows. Critical language then becomes light, a benign technology of knowledge, not a space or pickaxe, some violent instrument. Form and content become deliciously inextricable in a lover's discourse, making it a program for critical writing that is enduring, conceptually dense and light as poetry. And this difference between the surface and the core, text and subtext, which I also found really beautiful, and I felt it also kind of connected to a lot of the things that we're talking about. So I was wondering if you could just say something about that as well, because I thought that was really amazing.
Oh, thank you. That's so kind. It's so heartening to have somebody else read out one's work. Thank you. Really appreciate that. Actually, I wanted to bring this up also to invite you to respond as well, because I think when we opened our conversation, we were talking about Kosofsky-Sedgwick's essay about paranoid modes of knowing. And she, in the essay, cites the psychoanalyst Melanie Klein and her work, in which she positions paranoia as one end of a continuum and depression as the other end. And then she says that the depressive mode, I'm being very crudely paraphrasing here, but she says that the depressive mode somehow processes the object of paranoia into a kind of whole, which is the reparation reparative reading and the reparative writing that we were discussing earlier. She says that Klein terms this process of reparation love. And I really wanted to link it back to Sontag's idea of an erotics of art rather than a hermeneutics. So there's something about that love itself as a kind of strategy or a form, just this way of engaging with art and other discourses rather than a process of excavation, which is Sontag's point. So I think that made me think about love as an alternative to the paranoid framework. And so love can be one way of, or the erotics can be one way of thinking about a different framework to approach criticality, critical writing, not with suspicion, but with a kind of vulnerability and tenderness and care, again, to go back to that word, that listening in a literal sense can embody.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And I mean, I think this is also like the brilliance of Sedgwick is that she kind of does both. I mean, in taking Melanie Klein, she's kind of questioning theories of Freud and bringing up, really trying to put Melanie Klein more in the picture, whilst really thinking about these positions of the reparative and the paranoid. And she's actually also kind of performing this in a sense with the references that she's also looking at in the text. So there's a lot of brilliant writing on different levels going on. And I feel like actually your quote does that a little bit as well, somehow bringing Sontag into the picture more too, which of course is then, again, there are these strategic moves as well going on here, right? That are also very interesting, I think. Mm.
Yeah, indeed. And I think it's always interesting to go back to these choreographies set up or produced in the times before us. With every generation, something new emerges. So that's kind of also really interesting. And, like you're always also reading it within your own time and your own context. So there's something new that you're able to see, I think.
But at the same time, I do also feel there is a more radical position also to take in now I mean, whereas her text was really very radical in the time that she was writing in the 80s and 90s.
Also, maybe one thing that I've been thinking about, again, in this context of imagining what an erotics could manifest as perhaps, or could mean for writers and curators or cultural practitioners who work with language, is thinking about the form of the transcript itself, because it kind of converts the spoken, the oral into the textual. And I think that that's something that I'm also quite interested in. Again, to go back to description and, describing with love, describing with care, with attention. And so the transcript, I think, or the epistemology of the transcript, I think that's something that maybe is a way of thinking about the erotics again. In a way, it conserves the affect that you brought up and the substance as well of this sort of informal, casual ekphrasis. And then it can lend itself to other experiments with art writing. In fact, this is one piece I just want to briefly mention. There's this Indian artist, Arshi Ahmadzai, and I interviewed her on my podcast 2 or 3 years ago in Hindi, which is both of our first language. And there's an English language transcript as well. 2 or 3 years after I did that interview and put it up on my podcast, I was commissioned to write a piece about a work of hers, an artist book that she produced called Nafas. And I found myself going back to the interview and kind of re-synthesizing it and reworking it. And so many of the elements of process that she had elaborated on, or even the more philosophical discussions that we'd had, that I don't think we necessarily could have sustained in a print interview, but were accessible in an oral interview, in a podcast form. They found their way into the piece. And that was learning for me as well about this kind of transmutation or this movement between the textual and the oral. And I've actually started thinking about something like the interscript, which is both text and, oral, something that's in between.
So that would be perhaps both text and recording.
Something like that, yeah. I just want to read this, and because we were talking about love, so this review that I wrote of her book, I kind of feel like maybe it's something that represents my experiments with these forms or these movements. So I'll just read out a little bit, just a paragraph. Love letters have a long history in the Indo-Islamic tradition as part of the Persianate murasilat epistolary genre. The Urdu word for letter, khat, is derived from the Arabic for line, a type of mark that spans distance, connecting the writer to the paramour addressee, both taking turns expecting a response, as loving and waiting become co-constitutive. The delicate lines drawn across or crisscrossed as grids constitute a map to locate the lover, securing them in a graticule of erotic yearning. The temporality of expectation between letter and response provides the affective plane on which the lines are drawn in nafas. This is the artist as Virahini, that ancient South Asian heroine afflicted with the pain of separation or viraha, waiting for reply or return through the bara masa of plague, composing her Penelopead on manjarpat cloth. And so all of this was, conversations we'd had in the podcast. I mean, not in this language, but I think that was the great experiment for me, to kind of take something that's conversational language, but rich and meaningful, and with the artist's disclosures and explanations and philosophies embedded in it, and then kind of rework it, and not even necessarily to agree with it. In this case, it was a very affirmative kind of a response, but sometimes you also don't agree with the artist, and you might share that disagreement in the final text that you produce. So I think just the process of it, I think the method of it is something that is really important for me to think through some of this. Interscription.
Yeah, that sounds really great. Yeah, that sounds really interesting. Interscription. It's something actually that I tried out during COVID, never fully finished, and regret it a little bit because it all kind of also just started. We decided to start writing to each other and somehow combining this writing with conversations, but then it just kind of trailed out.
But you can reactivate it, and it's such a great experiment, I think, with all of the things that you want to do in terms of a rehearsal-based style of curation, or this kind of a collaborative co-writing, and a real kind of challenge to the processes or structures that have become so established now, and kind of replicate the same kind of mode of address.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is also an important point, become established. And also, I feel often are just actually really kind of false as well. There's this kind of image that's been established often in these practices that don't reflect the actual reality of the situations, and people are speaking more about, I mean, especially now also with curators and institutions and things, people are trying to kind of air more of those secrets that have been kept. I mean, that's part of this kind of whole reparative thing as well, I guess, is to really try to talk about the realities that would also make it more vulnerable, because it takes away certain authorities. If you start speaking about the fact that actually 60% of your job is really like organization and good communication rather than me sitting there thinking about content, these things start to, obviously you're kind of demystifying as well, which is important, but also comes with a certain risk.
No, indeed. That's really well put, actually. And kind of like goes down to brass tacks, I think, which is always important amidst all of the conceptual conversations that we have, to kind of keep things really real as well about the material realities of our industry and our sector. It's not delinked from the other broader infrastructures of capital and all of that. So
yeah, totally.
Thank you so much, Jerry. That was really great, and really appreciate you giving me so much of your time.
Yeah, it was really, really great. I've written down a couple of words in like really big letters with circles around it. So so it's definitely, I'm going to come back to it. Yeah, so thank you so much. And yeah.
Thank you. And I hope we get to collaborate someday on some other project. That would be lovely.
Yeah, I hope so too. Yeah, I hope you come back to Winterthur also. That would be nice.
I hope so too.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning into Artalaap with curator, writer, and director of Kunsthalle Winterthur, Geraldine Tedder. As we spoke about vestibular criticism, that is, criticism that helps balance and locate us in time and space. It was a great pleasure for me to think alongside her about writing and curating in a variety of ways. As repairing, as listening, as collecting, as caring, and as loving. You can view my blog about the Art Writers Award residency at takeonartmagazine.com/blog and learn more about the Kunsthalle Winterthur at kunsthallewinterthur.ch. If you enjoyed the podcast, please like and share the episode over social media. For more information and updates, you can follow us on Instagram at art.alaap and on Twitter at RTALAAP.